Peace at your hand. Part 2. Chapter 6, The Endless War, Mr. Ignorance at Work. A typical senseless war of our time that destroyed millions of souls and sent them home untimely because of human greed, power hunger, anger, lack of knowledge, disobedience to the divine law, recklessness, and the regrets after. Before the war. In the early 60s, a new nation was born in Africa. The name of this nation was not from any common bond based on any national identity or ethnic belonging. It was an administrative convenience for the colonial masters to give the name Nigeria based on a common geographical boundary, in this case Niger area, divide them, forge them again, and call them a name. In this wise, the nation remained divided and owed their respective allegiances to the colonial master instead of their new nation. The truth was and still is that there is no nation other than a geographic entity created by the colonial master for their administrative convenience. However, a nation is a nation no matter what. People have to adjust and live on compromises instead of principles. This is not an easy task indeed. Notwithstanding, the representatives from different groupings held a democratic election into the House of Parliament that was supervised by the colonial masters. In the House of Parliament, no one could expect miracle to happen in this house. Here we have ministers without experiences, leaders without any national feelings, because there was none. The only thing they discussed was how to share the national cake. This in essence means to put the cart before the horse, and when the cart can no longer pull the horse, of course the race ends. In so doing, they have invited Mr. Greed to lead the House of Parliament. This he did until a series of military rules changed hands. Mr. Greed does not leave his seat in any place he has been called once, so he continued to lead from military rule to military rule back to civilian rule and will ever lead until there is total collapse of the nation, resulting in a total change of human beings with principles and national goals. It is no wonder that the first sign of things to come was the bloodbath. The war of propaganda. It started with political disunity, motivated by greed and avariciousness. People have started to plan on economic gains from war implements, military food supplies, heavy artilleries, bombs, warplanes and naval ships to mention but a few. Business interests had intensified their campaigns and lobby groups had formed groups and sides were taken. Overseas contact groups were ready to act. War propaganda became inevitable. Pride and power came into the show. The lie industry was the first to go into production on both sides. It was easy to fabricate lies and counter lies from either of the opposing parties. The voice from both of the elders became obsolete and human love waxed cold. Pride, power and of course might, controlled the scene. Foreign interest powers complicated the case. Meanwhile, the common person was suffering on both sides. The day was pregnant with unknowns, uncertainty, insecurity, and fear while the giants on both sides were on their top enjoying the blood to be shed in the battlefield. Both sides used the crowd theory to amass innocent persons to the slaughterhouse of the foreign economic giants on the agreement of their fellow citizens. All these were done in the name of power, pride and ignorance. Days passed, weeks passed, the tension was mounting high, hatred increased, newly fabricated lies raised their heads, and world media was in action in support of their own interest groups. Both local and foreign media had their own self-interest. Who finances the war? Is it the poor common people who cannot afford their daily bread? Is it the state who could not balance its own annual budget? Is it the foreign interest groups that would hold the state in perpetual economic bondage? Diplomatic wrangling started, taking care of their national interest. Now the stage was set for action. Who would first trigger his gun? The first to trigger the gun is the aggressor. This is the rule of the game. The game of blood, the game of hatred, the game of economic brutality, the game of death, the game of total human annihilation, the game of human injustice to man, the game of power play, the game of pride and the game of might. That was what it was all about. Is there any truth in war propaganda? This is a lie construed to be true in order to mislead human beings to create hatred and discord among themselves. The shooting war, the D-Day. That D-Day had come. The common person woke up to the deadly sound of machine guns, artilleries, bomb raids, screaming and shouting of personal attacks from hired soldiers chasing women and young people to commit atrocities. Nobody knew where to run to, that was safe. From where did the enemy enter the village? Where was the escape route to the nearest refuge? Where are our armies? Do they not know that we are in danger here? That was a great commotion indeed. The mighty had started the war. What does it help after all said and done? The winner of the war is always right. The dead have no right in the land of the living. Is there any fair play in war than to kill and kill, including the last person you meet or see? We are talking about a village with a population of 30,000 people. The money-mongers and the black sheep in the village had betrayed the community and guided the enemy into the heartland, leaving no escape route for the people to save their dear lives. This led to a total extermination of a whole race, yet it was not genocide because the mighty had committed this horrible atrocity. There was no survival and no witness to testify. Even if there was a witness, who would listen? In war such as this, the mighty are always right. This was day one of the Holocaust, which marked the beginning of the deadly Operation Wipeout. What do you wipe out? Why do you wipe out? Wipe out the entire males in a race, small, young and old. Entice their women with money and render them barren. Maim the pregnant women and remove the entire male babies in their wombs. This is the Operation Wipeout. One wonders why the world should allow this inhuman operation policy, carried out by a ruling government of a nation, against its own people that it rules. The answer was that the world did not allow it. However, the economic policies of some of their respective countries had no alternative answer. When the hands are tied, the mouth waits to see. In the world where we live today, collective might is greater than one man is, and so the war continued unabated. Why is this inhuman policy directed against a race? What crime have they committed that the state law could not handle? Is the government so weak that it cannot enforce the law? How can an entire race commit one crime at the same time? What crime has an innocent baby in her mother's womb committed that would warrant him not to enter into this world? Has the government any right to determine who is worthy to enter into the world? I leave the reader to judge for himself. Should we stand on the fence and look while the genocide continued without control? What shall we do? Shall we do anything at all? Rumors have it that several war fronts were opened the same day. The defending group was branded the rebels against the government, because they were forced to defend their lives, their children, wives, and their properties. The world now has reason to justify their passive attitude. It was an internal affair of the government to crush the rebels. The government troops have the right to shoot and bomb the rebels without killing anybody. The government soldiers, artilleries and bombs do not kill human beings except the rebels, for the rebels are not human beings. For this reason, the foreign countries have the right and moral courage to supply arms to the government without any qualms. Therefore, the war continues and spreads all over the country. After 1 year, the war continued as if it just started with human beings, dying like rats without grave, in the bush inside the war front, in the streets and in the market squares. The government troops, their warplanes, their artilleries and their sophisticated guns could not crush the rebels. The second year passed, yet the rebels were not crushed. The death toll of the civilians, the children, and the women were rising uncontrolled, yet it was an internal affair of the government. Hunger and malnutrition killed a good part of the victims. The mass killings by the warplanes in the market squares, church houses, hospitals and other public places resulted to about 30% of the total massacre. Yet it was an internal affair of the government to crush the rebels. Nevertheless, the SS Operation Wipeout lasted for a period of many years without accomplishing the aims of the one-month plan. After effects of the war. During the war, the only law in force was military law, otherwise called martial law. There were no ordinary police on the street except the military police with their guns ready to shoot. Civilians that ran away from their homes returned from the refugee camps. Life was miserable, there were no more homes to go to. Food was not available. However, the charitable organizations did their best to help. Hatred was written on the faces of the depressed. The soldiers worsened the situation by their continued presence. The soldiers from the war fronts began to come back home. There were great lamentations everywhere for those young men who never came back again. Human losses on both sides of the war in 3 years can be estimated to near 1 million people, while the material cost was huge. Thousands of people died of malnutrition, heart attack, high blood pressure and malaria fever following the inhuman situation people found themselves in after the shooting war. Those who were on the receiving end of the bullets and artilleries of the war, had difficult to understand that human beings could be so cold-blooded as to destroy fellow human beings in the way it was done, without just cause. However, there must be forgiveness and reconciliation. Moment of reconciliation. Despite all that had passed, if human beings must live together, they must learn to love one another. They must forgive and forget, not for others' sake, but for their own sake, because hatred kills him that bears it. Before the war ended, the entire country was divided into several autonomous states, by military decree. This followed the principle of the colonial master of divide and rule. However, it was another alternative way to share the national cake. It helped the bullet receivers to consolidate themselves to fight for their survival and forget the past. In this way, reconciliation was not as difficult as it could otherwise have been. The effects of war propaganda. The effect of war propaganda never dies. It is always alive as if it is today. It has created mistrust and suspicion among people. War propaganda is a deadly weapon that kills slowly and surely. I have met many friends of mine from the other parts of the war, and the only thing they remember is the propaganda lies. None of them remembers his or her relative and friend that lost his life because of the war. This deep distrust among people, in addition to the active role of Mr. Greed, has added to the problems in the society after war. Insecurity. Before the war, it was very easy to mobilize soldiers by crowd theory. Nevertheless, after the war, it is very difficult to demobilize them. In the war you teach them how good it is to steal, kill, destroy, break houses, molest people and put fear in them. This is a very big task indeed, notwithstanding, because these soldiers had been out to destroy and loot without control with their guns and ammunitions, like wild beasts for 3 years and more. No matter how effective you may be, there is a remnant of them that are still armed with their guns. These remnants of soldiers have contributed in no small measure to the uncontrollable wave of insecurity in the country. Most of them have no job, they did not return to the barrack as should have been the case. The good economy of the country is centered on the top, while the poor and the abject poor are on the lower cadre. These abandoned and unrecognized veterans join with Mr. Greed to get their own share of the national cake from those that have. The abject and other residues of the people also join hands with the war-trained soldiers to find their daily bread with the help of Mr. Greed. The armed robbery, kidnapping, killings and abductions in the society today, can be traced back to this after-war effect and the beginning of our camouflaged democratic jingoism, hence the endless war in another front. Mr. Greed. This man Mr. Greed is a powerful attribute of a natural man. He works as a team with Mr. Pride and Mr. Avariciousness. These 3 persons have a union with money and material and form a formidable power that is capable to overthrow any nation in the world. This power destroyed the Roman Empire. They act as mercenaries, and are ready to come to you anytime you invite them. In their trio, Mr. Greed is in the apex while Mr. Pride and Mr. Avariciousness are the two supporting pillars. Wherever they are invited, they never leave the place until their mission is accomplished. Their mission is to destroy and crumble whatever is in place. It is important to know that they only come by invitation. When Mr. Greed comes to anyone, on invitation, of course, he first blinds the eye of that person from seeing the right thing except money and number. It invites Mr. Pride to get into the person's brain and puff his head with the idea of superiority over others. This creates a fertile land for Mr. Avariciousness to hatch his eggs of lofty desire. Conclusion. This is a true story of a nation in Africa in the middle 60s. It is a representation of what is going on in other parts of Africa, Middle East, and other developing nations of the world today. Perhaps, if we summarize the story above, we may find out the true course of this feudal war and the consequence thereof, and then we can ask ourselves this question: is this horrific sacrifice worth the price? Summary. We asked for independence from our colonial masters. They granted us the independence. They formed a geographical area and called it our country, and we accepted it as our nation. We formed a democratic parliamentary constitution under their supervision. We conducted election into this parliament, and they supervised it for us. Then we were independent. We went into the House of Parliament, but without adequate preparation for the day's work. We did not know who it was that we represented, their needs, what to do that they may feel the blessing of the independence. We were happy that we were the leaders of a people we did not know well enough. We had in mind to go there to ask for our share of the national cake, for it was the colonial master's property, because as we say that, he who is not fast loses the meal. We did not know that that national cake is not colonial master's cake but our cake. We did not know that we should first forge this geographical area into our nation and unite all the people that live in them into a strong nation. We did not know that it was our duty to take care of the national property and distribute them equally to all the people. We did not know that we were the fathers of the whole nation. We did not know so much, therefore we asked the help of Mr. Greed to lead us. Perhaps he knew better. We see now that Mr. Ignorance has led us into the hand of Mr. Greed. Had we known, we could have done better. Now Mr. Greed has called his associates and they have taken over the nation. What shall we do? Is it too late? This is a great calamity indeed. This has led to a series of blood sheds among the people, yet the cake is not shared equally. Mr. Ignorance, Mr. Greed and their associates have taken over the entire nation. We can only wait to see the last man, if ever. In this great lamentation, one general had this to say. The reflection of an unknown general. Why do I exist at all? Am I here to fight, kill people, make big name, eat the best food, drink, accumulate as much money as possible and die? If everyone does the same thing as I do, will there be peace in this world? How many people will remain on earth to mourn the dead? Shall we no more mourn the dead? Will my posterity survive the Holocaust? Shall we not forfeit the last 6-foot apartment, which the Mother Earth owes us? Will our remains not turn into a mountain of human carcass? Will the fowls of the air, the ants and all the pests of the land join together to have eternal feast of human carcass? What shall I do? Therefore, the war continues in many different phases and fronts until the nations involved cease to be, and a new generation is born.